In this video, I'm going to make a little wheelbarrow planter for the garden. It'll be made from three main components: a bucket, a wheel, and a frame.
I'm going to be using oak for this project because it works well outdoors, it looks nice, and it's nice to work with. But before I start cutting things, I need something a little better than that drawing to work from.
I don't usually do detailed plans or drawings, but doing a basic plan with just a few measurements can be a good idea, especially when trying to replicate or make a scaled down version of something. By drawing it all out on paper, I can get an idea of how big all the elements need to be proportionally to each other, and it at least gives me a bit of direction and confidence to start cutting. I'm going to start with the bucket, which is probably the easiest component. I have a bit of an eclectic mix of saws, and recently I've started to sharpen some of them. Unfortunately, this one can't be sharpened, but that doesn't mean it can't still make this cut. It'll just take a little longer. Or if you prefer speed over hand tools, you could just use power tools. Which saw do you think did a better job? I'm going to be using predominantly hand tools on this project, and not because I'm a hand tool purist or against power tools or anything, it's just what I prefer to use this time around. I think there's a lot to be said for just enjoying the process of making, and whether that's using hand tools or power tools or a mix of the two, it doesn't really matter. Once I have the main bucket pieces cut, I use a sliding bevel to figure out the angle I'd like to cut on each of the pieces. There's no specific angle I'm working to, I'm just adjusting things until it looks right to me. Okay, now that I've got an angle I'm happy with, I can cut that on both of the side pieces, and then repeat the process on the front and back pieces. I'm also tidying up the saw cut with the hand plane a little to get things nice and smooth. One of these days I'll put together a shooting board to make sure I'm doing this square, but that's a project for another day. Nice. With all the pieces cut, the next thing I fumble around with is taping them all together to get a sense of how it's going to look and start making a plan for how to join them.
Okay, so I've got some tape on here loosely holding things together just so that I can see how it's all going to look when it's finished and get an idea of the shape of everything. And I've noticed a couple of issues, which you maybe have as well, which is that as I've cut the angles on these side pieces, it's effectively made the length a little bit longer. So the piece that I cut for the front is now too short. But there's a simple fix for this, which is that I'll trim a little bit off the sides to bring them to the same length. The other issue is around the back. Because I cut the same angles on this back piece as I did on the front piece, that means they're wrong. Because the front piece is angled inwards, this piece is perfectly vertical. So because the angle is different, it means that the angles on the side need to be shallower. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, don't worry about it. It just means that I need to cut a new one of these to fit in the back. And this back piece I can use for another project.
After trimming the sides and then cutting a new back piece, I can move on to the joinery, and on the back piece I'm going to use dovetails. I've cut a few dovetails at this point and they're improving but could still use some work, as you'll see in a moment. But this is the perfect project to practice them on, as it's going to live outside anyway, and once it gets rained on and expands and contracts, the dovetails will likely separate or warp anyway. Now, I'm not necessarily following any one technique or method for cutting and measuring these dovetails. I'm just using and combining techniques or methods I've seen other people use before, and I might be doing lots of things wrong. But is it really wrong if it works? Okay, so this one was a bit gappy, and you can see where I've accidentally scored a double line, which probably threw me off. But this is still a plenty strong enough joint, and the practice I had on this one made the second one much better.
Okay, that is the dovetails on the back done. They're not perfect, but I'm still learning, I'm still practicing, and they're pretty secure. They should hold it together, especially since it's going outside and they'll probably separate at some point anyway. Now it's time to move on to the front. The back was relatively easy. There's an angle one way, but the other way is square, whereas the front, there's an angle out this way and an angle up that way. So that's going to make the dovetails just extra difficult. I think what I might do instead is a housing dado or some kind of rabbit joint. I'm not entirely decided yet, but it's the end of the day, so I'm going to sleep on it, think about it, and come back tomorrow morning with a solid plan of how I'm going to attach this front section.
The next day, I started by marking out a housing dado, scoring with a knife to get a good crisp edge on the joint. After that, it was just a case of chiseling out the waist down to depth. Once I'm close to the depth I want, I switch and use a router plane to get the bottom of the joint nice and consistent. A little bit of cleanup on all the pieces, and the bucket is ready to slot together.
Alright, and that is the bucket more or less all together. On to the next bit. I'm going to make the base, glue the whole thing together, and then move on to making the frame.
That incorrect piece from earlier turned out to be just about the right size for the base, so I trimmed it to size, planed an angle on the sides to help it sit better in the bucket, and glued the whole thing together.
Okay, so while the bucket dries, I'm going to move on to the frame. And what I'm aiming for is two long pieces that start at the wheel with an axle going through so that it can turn and end down at the handles. The thing that's going to make this extra complicated is that as we get towards the back of the bucket, I want to angle the two handles up so that they're raised up a little bit because I think it'll look better.
Before cutting anything, I spent a good amount of time measuring and planning to make sure I got the parts the right length and figure out how I was going to do the angles.
So that last shot might have been a bit tricky to see, but what I've basically done is I've measured the bucket on here and then given myself enough space out the front so that when I make the wheel, I'll have space for that and it doesn't touch the bucket and it should be able to free spin. So I can cut here to give myself enough so that I can trim it to the perfect size later. And then out at the back, I've just kind of done this by eye for the moment. I've ramped it up a little bit and I'm keeping it the same thickness here as down in the main section, but what I'll probably do eventually once I've got them cut and together is taper this down a little bit with the spoke shave. So that hopefully gives you a bit of an idea of what I'm thinking.
With one frame piece marked up, it was time to cut it. And there are a number of ways I could have done this, but with my desire to use hand tools and my freshly sharpened saw on this project, I got the piece into the vise and started cutting. I have to say, having a vise like this has been a game changer, and its ability to hold pieces of all sizes securely is super handy. Like many of my hand tools, it's a second-hand eBay purchase, and for those looking to get started with woodworking, buying and restoring your own hand tools is a fantastic way to build out a collection of tools for not a lot of money. At least, compared to buying new ones, that is. Anyway, my plan here was to use the panel saw to cut the straight sections and then switch to a coping saw to cut the curved bits. Once I'd cut through the rest with the panel saw, I could move on to cleaning up the roughly cut curve. And this is where another second-hand eBay purchase, the spoke shave, came in handy, which is a very satisfying tool to use, and it's great because it essentially allows you to plane and smooth curves. The straight section also needed some cleanup, but a few strokes with the number 4 and these were nice and smooth too. A quick trim to size, and that offcut can be used for the cross members on this frame.
So that's one side of the frame. Now I'm ready to cut the other side, and luckily the offcut, I say offcut, this is bigger than the original piece, has roughly the same shape on here as this one does, so I'm part way to having it cut. The other lucky thing is that the cut off from the front of this piece is enough to be able to create some brace pieces in the middle. So by the time I've got this one cut, shaped, another cut off from that, and I should have all the pieces I need to put this frame together.
A few cuts later and I had a second piece cut for the frame, which was a little rough, but that gave me a good excuse to use the spoke shave again. Once it was all smoothed, I brought the bucket back in and took off the clamps to see how the whole ensemble was looking, and I thought it was looking pretty good. To join the frame pieces together, I'm again using some simple dado joints. But before I glue the frame together, I'm going to move on to making the wheel. To begin with, I drilled a hole into the middle of a couple of square bits of wood, and then drew on a circle with a compass at roughly the size I wanted the wheel to be. Trimmed it close to size with a saw, and then chiseled down as close to the line as possible. I also used a rasp where the grain made it a bit too tricky or risky to chisel. Once the two circles were near enough to the size I wanted them, I drilled out the centres using a hole saw, and my plan is to use the smaller pieces cut with the hole saw as a central hub, and cut out a bigger hole in the larger pieces to make them look a bit more wheelie. But before I cut that hole, I'm going to glue them together, and I'm making sure to glue it so that the grain on these runs in opposite directions to give the whole thing a bit of extra strength. I got it loaded up with clamps until it looked like some kind of sci-fi robot, and then glued together the three central hub pieces. While all of that was drying, I figured it'd be a good idea to use a couple of the offcuts to start making some dowels that could be used as spokes and axles for the wheel. And this was a simple case of planing things to an octagonal shape and then smoothing it out to a circular shape with the spoke shave. Now, I didn't realise this at the time, but I've since learned that the reason a spoke shave is called a spoke shave is because wheelwrights back in the 16th century used these to shape the spokes on old carriage wheels. So it's pretty cool that I'm doing the same thing today, albeit on a much smaller scale. Once the glue is dry on the hub, I can smooth it into a nice circular shape with this Shinto rasp, and then do the same with the main wheel piece. For a guy who doesn't have a lathe, I seem to end up making a lot of circular things, which would absolutely benefit from being done on a lathe. But if you don't have something, you adapt and find a way, right? So that's what I'm doing here. And who knows, maybe one day I'll get power put into my workshop and get a lathe. Okay, to make these wheels look a bit more wheelish, I'm going to cut out a bit more from the middle. And because I've already used my biggest hole saw, I'm going back to the coping saw, which took a little while, but it did get the job done. Then, the cut just needed a bit of cleanup with the rasp.
Okay, so as I've been smoothing the wheel and the hub, I've been pondering how I'm going to get the spokes in. And I've decided what I'm going to do is very carefully cut the wheel in half, drill all of the holes that I need to drill, then cut the spokes to length, slot them in, glue the whole thing back together, and hopefully that should work.
Before chopping it in half though, I added a bit of a chamfer on the inside edge to make the wheel feel a bit less chunky. And then came the scary moment, chopping it in two. I used the thinnest saw I have, which is this little dovetail saw, so that I'm not removing too much wood, and when it comes to gluing it back together, it shouldn't be too noticeable. Once I had it in two halves, I could get access and drill all of the holes needed to accommodate the spokes, and also drill holes into the hub. Now, I definitely should have spent a bit more time figuring out a way to do these more accurately, as the drill bit did wander a bit and go off centre several times. But I'm sure the wheelbarrows of old weren't all perfect, and I can try and do a better job next time I make a wheel. Now, because all the holes were a little off centre, it did make fitting everything together rather tricky. But with a bit of extra encouragement from a hammer and some trial and error aligning the right holes, it all went together well enough, and I could get it into clamps and then come back the following day to finesse and tidy it up a bit. The only things left to do on the project now is to fit everything together and add a few finishing touches. First off, I drilled a hole for the axle and wheel to fit through the frame, and then glued the frame together. I gave the bucket some attention with the plane to even out all of the top edges, and smoothed out the front area, which was still a little sharp. While the glue was drying on the frame, I got it carefully loaded into the vise and started to shape the wheelbarrow's handles, which didn't go so well. But I put it back in the vise, tightened it more, and continued. When it came to attaching the wheel, I put glue onto the axle just around where the wheels sat on it, and didn't add any glue where it went through the frame, so that it can still spin freely. And to keep the axle from just sliding out, I added a little pin on either side. After gluing the bucket onto the frame, I added a couple of little stands at the back and it's finished. There are a few rough edges, but it's a garden wheelbarrow, and overall I think it's turned out great. It's not your everyday woodworking project, but it was a fun one to make, and we'll enjoy wheeling this to different spots around the garden and seeing how it weathers over the coming years. If you've enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.